So we can get started. I thank Mary so much for being here. Let me just say a little bit about her. She asked me not to go on too long, so I will keep this short. In terms of institutional affiliation, Mary's an associate professor in the Department of Communication and Culture and an affiliate faculty member in a number of different departments at Indiana: American Studies, Anthropology, and Gender Studies. And Mary will be moving now full-time over to become a senior researcher at Microsoft Research New England, which is a really big deal and very exciting in terms of Microsoft Research staking out a new set of research questions in and around qualitative work in particular. So we're thrilled to do that. Thrilled to congratulate her on that move. Mary's the author of Out in the Country, Youth Media and Queer Visibility in Rural America. And let me just say a couple quick words about Mary's work, and I said I wouldn't do this. So this book is on my syllabus for my qualitative methods seminar. And the reason why is because Mary thinks very rigorously about qualitative work. Mary is a model researcher in terms of somebody who thinks about sampling. She thinks about the logic of her research choices. She thinks about what her object of analysis should be. And then she puts in the time and effort, years, to go and actually conduct her work. And this book is a real model of enterprising scholarship. To study rural youth is challenging. To study rural queer youth is doubly challenging. And I am thrilled to say that Mary pulls it off quite brilliantly, and I highly recommend the book, both as a methods text and as an analytical text. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me here. I want to present really the core argument and some of the bridge work to the next project I'm doing that comes out of this research. And I'll try and keep it as tight as possible because I know we're a little tight on time, but I really want to run you through some of the arguments around what sorts of representations serve as the backdrop to the young people's lives, the young people I was working with, the lives that they're living, and really how they're trying to negotiate a sense of identity in places that we, in popular media and in general conversation, assume can't be habitable for lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer identifying or questioning young people. And I'll probably just slip into LGBTQ. Sometimes I'll just say LGBT, sometimes I'll say queer. I don't mean them to be interchangeable because for some of those young people, those have a lot of, those terms have a lot of saliency. But at the heart of this project was really to think about what does it mean to negotiate identity in relation to an imagined community that is, by popular imagination, by our everyday understanding, not physically present. And if that's the case, and it is an if, that I want to pose, and I want to problematize the assumptions I was making going into the field. But if that's the case, what kind of difference does digital media make to their everyday lives and to that negotiation? So I want to run through some of the assumptions that I'm working with. And I'm going to just give you a brief overview of what I'd like to talk about today. And as I'm getting older, I'm realizing I don't know which screen I want to look at. I actually want to start, and I didn't do this in the book, and I felt like what I love to do is set up what I think are the canonical kinds of representation that young people are working with. And I picked a very particular example because it was in the daily lives of youth I was meeting when I started my field work. And I would argue that these representations that I want to unpack represent the good gay life. And that they're really a full package, that there are some assumptions built into what does it take to live the good gay life that's presented primarily through mass media, remediated through digital media, but in a U.S. context it permeates these young people's lives. So it's not that they live a life where they don't know what it is that they would call themselves. It's right there on television, what words might be available to them. So it's a very particular kind of context for thinking about the relationship between one's own identity and the representations that are in play and available as texts, as narratives to use. And I make a case that there are meta-normative urban norms that are built into those representations that for the most part, particularly in terms of advocacy, and the original audience for this were LGBT organizers doing field organizing, political work in states like Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, that for those folks doing that kind of political work on the ground, they're working with a national conversation about what it means to be an LGBT person or part of an LGBT community that doesn't map on to the places I was working. So at the beginning of this, I really want to unpack what is the assumption that everyone's working with that I think arguably underpins not just popular representations, but political agendas. And then second, I want to work through, and I'd really love to hear your responses to an analytic that I develop in the book called Boundary Publics, as a way to think about what it means to establish a sense of identity and build social recognition in settings where you can't command the material goods, the capital, to create a counterpublic. So, and I can walk through those theories of the public sphere and counterpublics and what I'm talking about as I go, depending on how much folks might need that background. But in a nutshell, I really wanted to think, what does it mean if you're in a place where you really can't own the resources, in a very literal sense, own the resources to respond politically and socially to the marginalization that's organizing your daily life. And then the last part that I'll touch on today is really that bridge work. Where am I going? Is to think about, for the young people, for me, the practice of ethnographic work is to take the understandings of the people I'm working with and transform them through our dialogue into some argument about possibilities, what we might possibly do differently in our political work, what we might possibly theorize differently about how we relate to media and how deeply mediated our lives are at every moment. So right now I'm trying to think of how does this map onto conversations around digital media, social media, and mobile media in particular, and implications of the digital divide and digital inequalities in this question about identity. For the most part, the digital divide is the domain of economists and political scientists who are talking about disenfranchisement either in economic terms or the possibility of a big pipe of broadband bringing economic opportunity, or they're talking about it in terms of invigorating a citizenry. And I really want to think about what are the social implications of digital divide. What are the social cultural ramifications of it? So that's the setup. For the project, the larger project that I'm drawing from here, there are really three things that I was asking, and they're to mostly three different audiences. So I really wanted to speak to media scholars and get them to think about the relationship among different kinds of mediated experiences of identity. So popular culture is definitely not divorced from digital media, and it's definitely not divorced from peers and how they're talking about those media. So to be able to come into a conversation in media studies around audience and reception and effects of media, and suggest that there's something we can really learn by looking at a group considered on the margins. The second goal is a shout out to queer studies. So one of the other fields, one of the other disciplines I'm really speaking to, and probably was the first audience for this, because I'd say queer scholarship was trying to have a conversation with national advocacy, was to say most of our advocacy is organized around this notion of someone who lives in a city, who has a community of support, and they're trying to mobilize change through electoral politics. So my intervention here is to say, what does it mean if you don't have those resources? Or those resources look very different. And at the time, the response was, well, you just don't work there. You just get other work done. And in the age of statewide ballot measures, that's no longer an option. So I feel like the time has come to really think about how metanormative, metrocentric is a term from Judith Jack Halberstam, how much that's shaping how we think about identity and the implications for political work. And then lastly, this issue, the place I'm going, is to think about how digital inequalities are also in play when we're talking about negotiation of sexuality and gender. It's not just about economics. I don't think for anyone in this room that's big news, but if you've ever looked at any of the literature on the digital divide and digital inequalities, it's overwhelmingly concerned with how do we make these pipes work for getting jobs. And I really want us to expand the conversation beyond beyond just thinking that the internet is about supplying cheap labor or allowing people to stay in one place and do piecework. Like I'd really love to think more broadly and more fully about what digital media means culturally beyond its economic contributions. So this is sort of a shout out to the Information and Communication Technology for Development, ICT4D. Overwhelmingly, they're based outside the United States, so there's nothing more satisfying to me than to work in the rural United States and show them that there's quite a bit of work to do on digital inequality. So I'm usually the lone person from the United States, and it seems to make them chuckle. Usually they're working in Brazil, they're working in Africa, so it's nice to be working in Kentucky and have something to say. So as Daniel alluded, I spend a lot of time on this, and I hope to have a conversation with graduate students today or later about why time is necessary for qualitative work. I'm making arguments and some other work about the ethnographic significance of qualitative data, particularly when you're with different groups of people over time and the kind of material that you can get, that I would argue are not a matter of micro scale, but a different way of thinking about scalability of data and how complementary it is to more quantitative or computational approaches. So let me put that on a shelf for now, but to me, the time that I invested wasn't just necessary to find these young people. Well, that actually was not hard at all, and I can talk about that in Q&A. I think more to the issue is the amount of time you need to spend to build rapport with them, to be able to hear not just the language they're using for their identities, but to hear the context they give it. Hearing them give the same story to several different audiences, that will always bring up other questions. That's the kind of rich material you get through ethnographic work that you can't get through a short amount of time. And for my purposes, I was really interested in what role do digital media play in young people's lives. I did not want to start with young people already online. I wanted to start with who are these young people who are negotiating these identities, and then how does digital media fit into your life? So it was at the time very much a push to say we're dividing online offline too cleanly here. And if we're really looking for what kind of play there is between using digital media and other forms of support, we have to be able to see that the depth of that, the breadth of that.
Where in Kentucky were you?
All over Kentucky. Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, and the tri-state area were the primary places. And this is a strange thing for ethnographers. We generally don't say exactly where we've done our work, depending on the confidentiality. Because I was working with folks between 14 and 24. So the names you find in the book and the names that I use for anybody I'm going to be referencing here, unless they specifically said, no, I want to use my real name, are pseudonyms, and pseudonyms for the locations. Ironically, I was presenting this to a group of students in Berea, and a picture came up. Berea is Madison County in Kentucky, if you're familiar with the area at all. And the whole front row just like yelled out the young person's name. It was kind of an ethnographer's nightmare because you can't really keep confidentiality. But it was a good lesson for me. None of this is anonymous, so I can tell you later. There's also a triangulation that I'm doing here and looking at what kinds of materials young people are creating for themselves and what kinds of web-based materials are created with these young people in mind. So to be able to see what's already imagined as the kinds of needs they have, and it really spoke to the language of outreach, development, help that frames any of the national approaches to what do rural youth need. It's very much in the sense of there's an assumption that there's not enough there, that it's lacking, and that's part of what I want to unpack today. And again, for grad students in the room, I looked everywhere I could to be able to support some of the arguments and theorizing I was doing. So I was trained as a bit of a mutt, and that's such an advantage when you're doing a project that calls for looking at queer theory as much as you would look at science and technology studies and seeing why they should be in conversation with each other.
Trained as a mutt. I like that.
Definitely trained. Could not think of a probably more accurate representation of me. So these are my key arguments for this talk. These are the assumptions I want to make sure you know I'm making from the get-go, because I don't want to take them as given. And I do want to clarify their arguments. I mean, there are plenty of folks who would push against this. But for the purposes of this project, I'm looking at identity itself as always mediated always contextual. So it's going to change and mean something different and be articulated in different ways at different historical moments, and most important for my work, in different locations. So rather than imagining it's a process of self-discovery, it could be that. I mean, it certainly could, but I'm not a biologist. I'm not interested in that part of the question. I'm much more interested in when young people are coming to a place where they're using particular language, what are they using? Where do they find it? How do they work that language and their understanding of what those words mean when they say, I'm gay, or they are coming out, and to be able to air quote that as not a given, but rather a very particular story we have about how identity organizes itself. To be able to imagine that as always mediated, not just there. And that is not to say, and certainly many of the voices that you hear in the book, that young people don't experience their sense of who they are in deeply personal and essential terms. They do. Most LGBT identifying people I know do. So it's again to kind of set that to the side and say, yes, that's how we talk about identity. Is there a qualitative way to look at how identity formation and language comes together? And how it's bumping up against this backboard of popular media. And then the second is to argue that if identity is always mediated, and it's got to have materials to do that mediation, then wouldn't it be that digital inequalities are actually recirculating the centers and margins already in place that produce those identities? So for LGBT identities, if cities have always been the place where you need to be to have the good gay life, then it becomes its own kind of media object to unpack, to think, what is it about the city landscape, the infrastructure of it, and the media representations of it that become really central to the experience of, am I the right kind of gay? Am I gay enough? Do I look gay? Like, those kinds of concerns are absolutely the concerns I heard from the young people I was working with, because they are trying to achieve queer realness, is the way I frame it in the book. They're trying to achieve recognition, social recognition for an identity that doesn't have a gayborhood down the way that can say, oh yeah, you're one of us. So they're doing this work, and I want to be able to think of it as a very particular kind of labor. They're doing as much research as you can imagine, and that's many times how they're talking about it. But that means that they're also in position to places that produce that information. So how to literally think of these centers and margins that are producing the information base, you might say, for identity. So here's my favorite representation of the good gay life to set up. Hopefully it's, there we go. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And that's when it happened, when he came along.
How's it going? You had a busy night?
Just checking out the bars, you know? Toy, meet Hook.
Really? So you're into another?
Sure.
Where you headed?
Nothing special.
I can change that.
Oh, so cheesy. The cheesy 20. The cheesy 2000s. They were fine days. The reason I chose Queer as Folk, how many people in the room have seen or heard of Queer as Folk? Okay, so a few of you. It was a very popular series. There was a US series that was a rendition of the UK series. There's lots of debates about which one was better. I won't go there. And as it was airing on Showtime, it launched in 2000. It was starting to circulate as something you should see. Like, this is a representation of what it's like to be particularly a gay young man. And so the young people that I was starting to work with by 2001 knew that this DVD was on its way out. And this was one of the first DVDs that I encountered them basically taking to each other's houses and having house parties watching this program. So it is literally a recycling of representation for them. There's no, at the time there was no Showtime, you couldn't get Showtime in the communities I was working in. You just couldn't purchase it. It wasn't available. They didn't have premium cable. And even if you could, most of the young people I was working with were from working poor, working class, lower middle class economic backgrounds. They couldn't afford it. So the person who could host one of these shows was a very important person. And this first episode is showing us the introduction of Brian Kinney, who's a local bar owner and hot guy, and his new love, young Justin Taylor, who's just come out and left the suburbs for Pittsburgh. So it makes Pittsburgh look really exciting. So I think Pittsburgh got some great tourism out of this. And what I want to show you, or what I want to unpack here and underscore, is that when you look at the representations, if you're watching the show and the arc of the show, if you start paying attention to thematically what's available for that narrative about what makes the good gay life, I'd argue that that three things come to the fore, and that these three qualities are organizing principles of mass-mediated gay representation of what is the good gay life. What should I be doing? And I'm using gay very explicitly, but I think in many ways it becomes this placeholder for what lesbians may or may not do because they're in the cast, and a range of other identities. So the show, like so many other programs, does some representational work around other identities, but primarily it's gay young men. And the three things it tells us we need that really make a difference, and why Justin has just gone to the middle of Pittsburgh to escape his suburban family, is that you need a critical mass of LGBT identifying people. You need to find other people like you, who are going to validate you, are going to recognize you, are going to appreciate you for who you are. You need disposable income, so that early in the series it's about going to Meat Hook or other kinds of places, other bars. And I joke about that, but in many ways the counterpublic of bars, cafes, bookstores, music stores are absolutely the political history of LGBT organizing in the United States. In terms of representational fodder, they're the main brick and mortar places to hang out in most of these representations. It's imagined there's a physical place, we own it. It's ours. It doesn't belong to anybody else's, and I can keep others out. So a sense of solidarity and consolidation. And that disposable income later in the show, and arguably within LGBT politics, is also disposable income for advocacy work, to pay a nonprofit organization that's going to advocate on your behalf. So to imagine what it is that you gain by having this critical mass, you might say you gain this amassing of a power block of LGBT identifying people. And that feeds into organizing a counterpublic, where you really do have a physical space where you can feel a sense of safety, that you can be anonymous. And so the idea of anonymity as a way to be able to negotiate identity, to be able to do it in ways that create a sense of safety from your everyday job life or home life. So you imagine you're not going to run into your mom in the Castro, maybe. So that becomes a really important part of identity formation, that's what's going to allow you to become free and come out. The problem with this, if you think about the critical mass of representation in these programs, and this is still fairly true, that the critical mass is often young gay white men, so you don't have a sense of who else would necessarily be in this space except as extras who are somewhat faceless. So certainly in terms of evaluating, is this a good representation, we might say it doesn't give much material for young women. It certainly doesn't give much material for people of color. And it suggests that there's really no particular class exclusion within these spaces, although it does play out class tensions in the arc of the show. The second unpacking to think about is this disposable income really seems to have a priority in the show, that it's about a kind of social connection, and that's the most important use of these funds, is to get into a space where we can connect, and yes, then we can mobilize. So it certainly doesn't make an argument that you shouldn't be political first and always, but in terms of representing the good gay life, there should be a balance there. And so in creating that sense of there should be a balance there, I'd argue it creates a dichotomy in terms of being able to live one's life privately and have the pleasures of gay identity separate from the politics of that identity. And then lastly, it suggests that there really can be this command of space that's safe, that I can take for granted, that I can be wherever I want to be. I think all of those assumptions that are certainly problematic, and I don't think anyone would argue that's how it is in urban settings, but that they take on a very particular meaning in rural contexts. So if urban queer organizing and identity formation become the place where you have the most possibility for the good gay life, it sets up the rural as always backwards, always lacking, endemically hostile. Because it couldn't possibly have, and we walk you through why this would be the case, it couldn't possibly have the kind of critical mass of LGBT identifying people and the kind of anonymity that is on display in these representations. If you live someplace where you've never met a stranger is the organizing logic. So anonymity is not okay, and it's not really something you can count on. That doesn't provide you safety. And where being familiar as local is actually the most important identity. Not being recognizably gay, but being recognizably so-and-so's son or daughter is the most important social identity being trafficked in rural communities. And I do mean trafficked. It's literally, if something comes up, the first thing you say is who you're related to. So to be able to see how important that identity is and to be able to think differently about why it might be a young person would choose that local identity over an identity that doesn't just mark them as different. Marking themselves as LGBT identifying or questioning, it isn't just about saying I'm queer, it also has the charge of urban. So you're also marking yourself as somebody who's affiliating themselves with something that happens in cities. And for the communities I'm working in, that was a considerable risk if you wanted to keep your alliances clear. I think also that there's no way in which you can have this kind of amassing of individual or even shared collaborative wealth to do the sort of social organizing, political organizing that we imagine happens through the critical mass of organizing in cities, precisely because it's the sampling issue of I'm working in places that are generationally, systemically impoverished. So mustering up the $30 for the $30 a year for a membership in Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays was a challenge for a number of the families that I worked with. And that I think is really hard for national advocacy organizers to reckon with because most of their organizing models are membership-based, chapter-based. It's about locals being able to put in money, private funds to support nonprofit organizing, and they're not sure what to do with places that literally don't have the income base, that tax base, to do that basic kind of funding that's not provided by the state. So this all is in dialectic with an absence of the nation state to provide these sorts of resources. That's why the US context is very particular. I mean, there are other countries, other contexts where it is precisely the nation state. It's the public sphere that provides information, resources, youth centers, educational programs for these young people. In the United States, it's left entirely to private funding. And even that's pretty tough to get away with in some communities. So I don't want to state this lightly. This is a big issue that there aren't ways for these communities to organize under the model that's currently in place that's primarily an urban-based model. You also can't really do voter identification in the same way. So if you imagine doing voter identification on an issue where you go to the neighborhoods where you know people are already on your side for the amendment issue, that is really not politically viable in most of these communities, precisely because you're again working against this fairly well-established logic of don't talk about something that's going to disrupt the community. And there are very few venues for doing that kind of disruptive work because there is no anonymity. It's not like I'm going to walk away from that door and never see that person again. Well, odds are they're the person I have to rely on, and I have a great story about this, to have your appliances fixed. So very, very fundamental concerns here. And then lastly, and this is where I'm going to spend the rest of my time, and I appreciate you letting me linger on some of these points. It's really important to note that these places don't have the basic infrastructure provided by a nation state or the private foundation funds provided by individuals with the tax, with the income to do this, to create safe, permanent spaces that are their own counterpublics. So they can't expect that they're going to be able to go into the gay bar, and every town is going to have their gay bar, and that's where they're going to have that sense of solidarity and social recognition. For a plethora of reasons. We could argue it's just because it's too hostile, it's too hot. I would argue from my research it has much more to do with financially it's not sustainable. And so what most of these folks are doing are recognizing the tentativeness, the ephemerality of the kinds of public spaces they can hold on to, how they can occupy them and let them go. And that's really how I developed this idea of boundary publics. That they're precisely places where they can perform this sense of difference, this sense of queerness, articulate that identity, and at the same time walking a very fine line of, and that doesn't disrupt that I'm also so-and-so's son or daughter.
Can you give an example?
I am. I'm glad you asked. So let me very quickly say, maybe I'll just shoot to the example so I can explain what I just said. Well, I think, let me shore it up a little bit to say the strategies they use local as a very strategic deployment of that identity. They absolutely use straight allies, because when you talk about critical mass, odds are, unless we had a major shift in our sexual and gender politics, that most of these places will have more straight allies than they will ever have LGBT identifying people. So in a town of 1,500, you are never going to find critical mass of LGBT people, at least in this generation's understanding of sexuality and gender, right? So they have a lot of straight allies to work with. And that's overwhelmingly who they're working with and who's advocating for them. They absolutely pool their resources in settings that are very uncomfortable with talking about anyone having wealth. So to show your wealth is also something that works against certain habitus of we're all equal here. And it's complicated. It's certainly not as clean as that. But walking around and saying, oh, I can fund that party, will very quickly devolve into fights over where the money should be spent, who should have a right to have that much money. So there's a very conscious effort of doing things that don't cost money, a constant pressure. Let's just not have it have anything to do about money. That's really tough to use as a way to get national advocates into your area. If you say, well, we're not actually interested in raising money. So that's a particular concern for them. And then lastly, this issue of how they occupy boundary publics. And this is, again, where I've probably spent most of my energy, is thinking that they necessarily are blurring online and offline. This isn't news anymore, but when I started this project, there was such a sense that going online was going to be about escaping where you're at. Like, certainly these young people are only going online so they don't have to deal with how horrendously awful, horrific their daily lives are. And I honestly went into it thinking, yeah, that must be the case. And I'm confessing that because I don't know too many people who wouldn't think, well, yeah, isn't it awful there? As someone who actually comes from a rural place, I knew it actually wasn't that awful. It's quite complicated. Yet my assumption was if you have access to being online, perhaps you're going to want to use it to escape. Far from it. Most of what they were doing was using digital media to ascribe a certain presence, to create this sense of queer happens here. And I'm going to show you some examples in a sec. They use it to transform the narrative of what it means to be rural and queer. And they use it to establish, but also to create a chance for social recognition, not just for themselves, but for their families. Because their families in many ways are also in the thick of these what I call the politics of visibility. You know, what it means to be a family member who has an LGBT identifying child is also in the mix. You're not an individual in these communities. You're part of a network of folks. And again, that's true in urban settings, but in terms of the narrative about LGBT life, it's we choose our families, we don't have to deal with that anymore. And my argument is that's a very privileged position to think about identity. To negotiate your identity from that position. So here are some pictures of some of my favorite boundary publics, which are parks in this case. But what's important to note is that a Pride picnic parade, I'm going to give you two specific examples, I won't spend too much time on these. A Pride picnic parade that happened at this picnic shelter, which is literally in the middle of nowhere. There's no way you'd run into this unless you're heading out towards this picnic shelter. There was a lot of debate about where to put a Pride flag. To be able to signal that there's a Pride event, a pride picnic happening here. And there were two audiences they were trying to signal to that this was going to be a boundary public for the afternoon. One was any family who might be coming to picnic. They wanted them to know there's some gay stuff happening here. So it was a way of, we've got this shelter, maybe you could take that picnic table over there. But there was definitely an awareness that they wanted to share the space. They were not claiming that they should have a right to this picnic shelter. Everybody used this shelter. It was a very popular place to go on weekends. The other audience were young men cruising in this park. So it's also a fairly well-known place to cruise for sex or for hooking up. And they wanted to make sure that anyone who was coming to the park for that knew they were going to be associated with these categories of identity. So there was a lot of negotiation of identity and a great awareness of this isn't their space, it's not straight space, it's actually it's a multifaceted space. How can we occupy it to demonstrate we are here, we have a right to this space, to share it with you, and then move on. And one of the key parts of this picnic really ended up being making sure all the pictures of the picnic got up on the website of the group that had hosted it. So a really important part of as happens at any family event, right? There were at least half the people walking around taking pictures of everything. So half the picnic, it's people trying to stomach my cold dish, which was not very good, and other people, taking pictures of people taking pictures. So it became a really interesting case of how important the web at that moment in 2004 was to creating a sense of presence. So when I'm defining these boundary publics, in some ways I feel like I just want to illustrate them more than I want to define them, and operationalize them. I really see them as strategies. So they're not places, and that's what I'm really getting after, is how media produces a sense of place, rather than it happens in a place. It's actually part of creating a sense of spatial experience for these identities that can fold up shop and go elsewhere. And I want to show you a few of those examples. And to be able to see it as we might be able to theorize where would these experiences of queer identity happen. They're probably going to happen in places where there's the material conditions to make it so. So what are the particular material conditions of a rural town that mean I'm going to have a boundary public pop up? And when I say, would you imagine it happens at the church skate park or the public library, the homemakers club? Those are the kinds of places where different events organized around talking about LGBT issues were happening in rural communities. And I don't think it's too surprising just because there's such a complete dearth of venues for these conversations. But to be able to think about how local, contextual, any of these experiences of identity as space are. And that they're certainly networked as well. So that they're networked, this is Dale, and he would be very proud for you to meet Miss Delicious. When I met him, he was doing drag with a group of friends, about 6 friends, mostly young white gay men, gay identifying young men. And their thing to do was to go to Wal-Mart to do drag. So this was one of those boundary publics that totally shocked me. So this is the example of where would they go? Where are they going to be able to create that sense of social recognition, a sense of both familiarity, but walking a line of making a statement that they're different, and recognize that it's not space they control, but it's space that they can shape and that they can queer. When I asked them why Wal-Mart, because I was honestly really surprised. I hadn't thought about Wal-Mart. And since then, I've found out that Sears, Fry's are also really good places to go. I don't know about JCPenney's. But at the time, one of the signals that this might be a potentially queer spot was because Wal-Mart had just passed domestic partnership benefits for its employees. Now, some of the young members of the group that were regularly going to do these they would drive to Wal-Mart, dressed before or during in the car or at Wal-Mart, going through the aisles and putting on makeup and outfits and being crazy. I mean, being kids. But at the time, they were both aware of those policies because they had read about them in national newspapers, and they had friends who worked at Wal-Mart who were telling them about guidelines. So seeing how they're reading those moves as ways of signaling acceptance, the possibility that they be allowed in this space. I'd say just as importantly, if you live in a rural area, you probably know this, it's a de facto public. It's wherever, it's the only place that's open 24 hours in these regions, and it is the place where everyone goes to be seen and to see who's there. I'm not defending Wal-Mart, but I'm saying it's serving, if anything, I'm saying recognize how it serves a particular need for publicness that's no longer met in a deeply privatized space like the rural United States.
So the schools, they did not have, is it listen chapters?
There were gay-straight alliances. That's a really good question. There were gay-straight alliances. I talk about one of them in the book. A few of them in the areas that I was working. For the most part, it was a really tough strategy. But there was a lot of work being done in Amnesty International chapters, human dignity chapters, 4-H, go 4-H.
Really?
Yeah.
They still have 4-H.
They still have 4-H. They do.
They don't have FFA.
They still have FFA, Future Farmers of America. I didn't see too many, I mean, I didn't see too many of those folks. But the students were using clubs already in place, and this I think speaks to the issue of coalitions. They were able to use the clubs that were already in place precisely because they became effective cover for what are the issues that we're dealing with. For the most part, those clubs were the places where the LGBT kids and issues around sexuality and gender were being discussed. What they all knew, and I think this is, I'll actually end on this point in a little bit, but what they all knew is that it was a highly contested move to create a gay-straight alliance, no matter if it's federally allowed. And I think this is where we have a disconnect of what do we advocate for and what can be mobilized on the ground everywhere. That for them, a gay-straight alliance, creating that had a very heavy cost. And it had everything to do with marking a specific group as different from the others. And that was incredibly fraught. If you think about the clubs I just named, none of them are identity-based. And that's one of the, aside from the Christian groups that are on campus, Christian Athletes is a very popular club within this area. You don't have that kind of identification built into the infrastructure of advocacy or of socializing at the school level. This last part that I want to comment about drag and Wal-Mart, and I'm going to give you one other example, or I might have to skip that example, is that critical, again, was recirculating these moments on the websites and through their email lists. So for most of these young people, when they were telling me, well, you know, what did you do last night? What was fun about it? It always came up as part of the narrative. And we posted it on the website. We made sure we got it up on the website. In fact, later on, one of the young people who managed most of, and these are websites that, this is pre-Google, so these are websites nobody would possibly be able to find unless they're looking for them. So most of them were off of free server, web hosting servers like Angel Fire, services that no longer exist. We would have to wonder if this could exist on Facebook. Like that's something I'm asking myself now, if that would work for them. And I can come back to that in Q&A. But that it was a critical part of their experience that it was recirculating through digital media. Because for them that marked not only that it happened, it's a record, but it also marked for them a way of amplifying, it happened here, if you couldn't make it, it's going to happen again. And it's that ephemerality, it's that iterativeness of their use of these spaces that I found so provocative. Because they would go every other week or once a month, and they knew there were so few places you were going to go, that's where it was going to happen, but their ability to be able to just have it happen, get the word out, go, and then put it up and say it's going to happen again, with this sense of claiming space that was understandably very much blasé to them. Because of course they would go to Wal-Mart. I mean, they actually laughed when I asked them that. They said, of course we'd go to Wal-Mart. Why wouldn't we? It's our Wal-Mart. I mean, that was really the attitude of it. And I thought that was a very interesting point, considering that they're also sharing this space. The other example I had for you that I think I'm going to skip this. I'll just say real quickly. One of the other really popular ways of organizing narratives is through a blog, early blogs that trans youth were putting together in the areas I was working in. And one particular trans young man, Alex, had this blog, and he would keep a detailed list of the surgeries he'd had, where you could get them, what changes were happening to his body. And his motivation for doing this had everything to do with, I want to make sure if anybody like me wants information that they can get it and that they'll know exactly where to go. Because he has to drive 2 hours away. He still has to drive 2 hours away for most of his health care. So it was no small thing. It would not be a matter of a quick referral or that there's an obvious formal network of information sharing around health care. Unlike an urban setting where the goal is to get young people to a specific center, I think in this case it's really for him, it was about making sure that young people had a sense that this was accessible at all. That this was something that was even within the realm of possibility. But it also became a really interesting place for him to give his family space for giving him affirmation. So his guest book, his mom, and I can say that for Q&A, but his mom's amazing. His mom and his other family members filled his guest book with all these like, way to go, Alex, you do it. And he would talk about how they never talked about this when they were at home in person. This became the place where they could have an exchange about what was going on for him, what it meant to them. There were no cases of anyone being hostile towards him, but there were certainly cases where family members were asking, and did ask him at one point, hey, are you sure you want to put those pictures up of you? That might be kind of embarrassing. So he was carrying on this dialogue about modulating his identity and his claims to it in relation to his family. And he was absolutely aware that there was no whether he wanted it or not, and I wasn't really clear that he wanted this, he was not going to be able to negotiate his trans identity as an individual. And I would argue that's true for any people I know negotiating identity. They're always doing it in relation to others, in other communities, and others who have stakes in that representation, or in that sense of identity. He was incredibly conscious of it. His website became the place where that was mediated in very literal ways. 17 when I met him, and he was going on 18 when he'd finished most of his surgery. So, and they're not a wealthy family, and I would love to tell you this story. So I will get through my notes so I can tell you this story about how he came to negotiate his identity, because it's really amazing. So for me, what comes together in these examples, and there are several more that I write about, it's this negotiating a lack of information, a lack of access to information, and this is the part that I'm really interested in. So if you're in an area where you really don't have rich resources, if I imagine that's something that's going to affect how I craft and how I articulate my identity, wouldn't it make sense that that's going to have a spatial component, a local component? So what is it about this kind of access that's going to change how I talk about who I am? If I lead with if I think about this social marginalization that's happening for these young people, and in many ways they're not imagined at all. So most of our, I'm sure I could ask any one of you, but most of the ways we talk about what is it like to be gay in a rural place, our assumption is it's awful. What should people do? They should go to a city. That's actually been the narrative since the 70s. I mean, that's get yourself to a city was one of Harvey Milk's favorite things to say. That in terms of LGBT organizing has remained much of the mantra. Is you really need to get to a city to get some skills and then come back to your community to organize it. So just that sense that you have to leave really compromises their sense that they have any right to say anything at all at this point from where they live. That they really struggle with this sense of being invalidated. And I've certainly talked with audiences who feel like they should be. That they couldn't possibly have anything to offer. And I think that's what I'm challenging here, is to imagine they actually have some really amazing strategies for talking with people who don't agree with them already, and that would be really valuable for advocates. So I'm going to really fly through this part. I'm really overwhelmed thinking, what does it mean now that for the most part digital media in the United States is moving to mobile devices? So internet access, smartphones become the place to work out, to provide information. The assumption is that you have someone not only who has access to that smartphone, but actually has a litany of opportunities, and they're choosing from these with their smartphone. So for the young people I was working with, this was just starting to come together. I had these moments where I just kind of panicked, like this is not their world. They have flip phones that are pay-as-you-go phones that have poor cellular service. They don't have anything that you could imagine would give them the download rates that would allow them to, say, watch a YouTube video like It Gets Better. So when we're thinking about young people accessing information, these young people are not, they are a potential audience, they're a latent audience, they're not a tappable audience. And I would like to make the argument that it's not about placing the technology in their communities, and I want to move to that point. I have this nice quote from Genevieve Bell and Paul Durish, but to be able to think about space as something culturally constructed, that's what I'm after here, particularly in relation to media. You know, if we really do imagine that there's going to be a different experience of queerness, how does that change how we think about our political goals? How does that change what kind of agenda setting we can do? You'd asked where I was, so that's where I am. That big white dot.
Where is Stanford?
Stanford is further up in there. So it's up towards the center, it's in Central. And this is from 2011. This is a map of broadband. As you may have read more recently, even the presence of, this is just the presence of broadband. This isn't mapping its speed. So again, the reason this matters for me is that for the most part we imagine it's just, most of the conversation, the discourse around digital divide is precisely about get the equipment in place and we're good. So the next response might be get the data rate, get the flow up and we'll be good. And the thing I want to focus on is that theorists who are thinking about digital inequalities, access is just the beginning of the issue. And this really shook out in my project. It wasn't so much whether or not the technologies were there. That certainly mattered. So in the case of the one young person who's managing the website, who's putting up all those pictures of the drag in Wal-Mart, he has a home computer. So that's a really important issue here. He has equipment access. Most of the places that I'm talking about, I'm going to focus on these two issues. If I think about these dimensions of inequality, we have so much further to go in policy than let's put computers in homes, or let's put computers in a community. And that's if I'm thinking about that in relation to mobile technology, if mobile technology starts to become the panacea for this issue, like just give everyone a smartphone and they're set, I would argue it even more thoroughly privatizes the issue, because we're no longer thinking about community centers, we're actually thinking about individuals. And I'm worried about which individuals are going to be given this sense of social support and validation in this scenario, where mobile phones become the way to provide access. So this is, clearly I stay up late at night thinking about this. I sound panicky already. The two qualities that I wanted to leave you with, in terms of equipment access, the broadband availability in southeastern Appalachia is about 44% of households. It's less than 28% in rural communities. That's just if the pipe is there. That's not people actually using it. That's do they have the ability to turn it on, right? And 30% of those homes don't have computers. So that is a starting point. For young people, the biggest issue for the young people I was working with is that their schools, and for the most part they're private libraries, they're public libraries, although there were really beautiful exceptions of public librarians who had complicated this. But in most cases, they have access to the technology at their school. That's one of the few places in town you can count on it. It's all filtered, so you can't access even things like the word gay without effectively a flag going up. And this is still the case in most of the schools. And it's also keystroke monitored. So as soon as I enter, I have to enter my name, I have to enter a password, and just like workers everywhere who do are doing this kind of labor, their whatever browsing they're doing is being monitored. Now it's more data than anybody's probably piling through, but it's an incredibly chilling, has an incredibly chilling effect on these young people. They never use their school computers for any search for health information or for finding other kids or for finding resources. So this is my biggest concern: is this provision of equipment is through state and federal funding that requires this sort of filtering and monitoring. So it's actually working against the equality that would be possible for these young people through the presence of the equipment. The place I see this also playing out is in the kinds of commodities that are built for mobile phones and how they rearticulate and reify the urban as the place to be. So if you go to gay cities, or if you go into the gay yellow pages, or if you go to a few of these other ones, they're pretty much focused on what are the city-based resources in place. And even in the case, and this I think is a really interesting twist on it, in the case of location-based locative media like Grindr, which is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's an application you can have on your phone. You can log in. Else is logged into that application. You can see each other, and it will literally say, Daniel and I are only X number of feet away. It's up to 200 feet. It's really an amazing thing if you're a young person and you use this and you realize that the next person closest to you is 70 to 80 miles away. So it reifies this sense of isolation that actually doesn't reflect their everyday lives. There are LGBT identifying people and they're aware of who they are. It's not that they're not there, but their sense of where should they go to find others. It shoots them way over 2 counties away. Instead of helping them locate in a more regionally specific way. Yes?
Related to that, can I ask a question, please?
Yes, please.
With all this data, have you looked into the impact or the role of something like Foursquare?
No, actually, that's interesting. I'm studying Foursquare right now. And what's really interesting is that Foursquare, the model of it as it's a service that lets you check in. It's mostly organized around vendors who want to build relationships with Foursquare. It has a few venues that are gay and lesbian specific. They're mostly bars. So for people under 18, and actually the irony for most places I'm working, these are dry counties that don't have alcohol. So you can't even have a bar. So for many of them, they have to use Foursquare, which is what this is where I'm going, to study how they basically work around what's constraining them. So they'll create ways to relocate where queerness can happen. So they'll check into places you couldn't possibly check into, fields in particular locations that otherwise are not going to show up on Foursquare's main grid as a check-in location, but that they could tell another friend, this is where it's at. So I apologize, I just realized I went over time. I think the big thing that I want to leave you with is thinking about what I think these young people teach us. And for me, I feel like they have a wonderful message for media scholars around thinking about how visibility politics are always in play in relation to representation. So when I think about the kinds of spaces that these young people are building out to have a sense of social recognition, which is a key component of social movement building, for them, it's certainly going to involve digital media, but it just as importantly has to engage on the ground what's possible beyond tapping somebody who's 70 miles away. That it has to contend with that. At least for now, as long as we make a case that identity formation is something you're supposed to share with another living human being. I mean, if we go the direction where it doesn't matter and we're all brains and vats, we're good. But for now, social movement relies on a kind of co-presence, and they're creating a sense of co-presence even in the absence of this critical mass of LGBT people. At the same time, I think digital media really give them a sense of being present. You know, it says, I belong here, and it makes this stake of this happens here. That they would say quite a bit with this defiance of, you know, I want people to know that we do this here. And who they're letting know, who their audience is, that's what was very interesting. It was both a ubiquitous audience, and it was at the same time anybody locally who might be looking for something like this. So it was both universal and particular in the same move. And then lastly, to be able to think about how identities are practices and they're a process rather than something that we necessarily discover. And if that's the case, and I do pose it as a question, if this is one way to think about identity, and it's been a way that's been out there to think about it for a while, then that means that media and spaces are playing very particular roles. And in this case, familiarity becomes a really critical piece of this puzzle for rural LGBT young people. So for advocates, and I know this is true in the state, thinking about where does family fit in? For these young people, there's no way to imagine doing political work that doesn't harness the connection to family. for example, and in a very explicit way. So it's something I've been trying to figure out how to translate into policy work. And then I'll leave you with one last thought, which this is kind of my own moralizing, is that in many ways there are multiple visibility strategies going on here. There are moments where it's incredibly important for them to be able to say, I'm here, I'm queer, get used to it. There are equally important moments where they want to be able to make sure that their identity as so-and-so's son or daughter or child is the most important identity that a local sees. And I would argue that has to do with really basic material concerns. They risk their jobs, they risk their homes, and they risk their families' livelihoods at different moments, depending on how they negotiate their identity. And so I think in those moments when they prioritize being locals, the example of the GSA, we tend to think, why aren't these young people acting on their federal right to have a GSA? Why would they just put up with having a human rights or a human dignity group? And I think what we need are some strategies and some politics that let us imagine something other than that's a sellout, but rather to see it as a particular kind of strategy that's being deployed in a really particular context. We just don't have a way of doing that, and I think in many ways we morally rank these visibility politics. So if somebody happens to be juggling more than one of these identities, somehow it seems like they're a sellout if they're not politically aligned with one at a particular time. The coalitional politics that these young people are constantly having to use, just because there aren't enough LGBT young people, they're always in coalition with a few kids of color, with a few kids who are working on economic justice, the few kids who are working on environmental justice. So they do this kind of basic coalitional politics because out of necessity there really aren't the numbers to do otherwise. And I think they offer a really great lesson for moving beyond this kind of identity hierarchy as a strategy, as a singular strategy. So with that, thank you. Sorry, one else. Thank you.